This is a full house. How is everybody doing? It's been a very long time that I've seen it full like this. You guys look gorgeous. Thank you so much for being here. There's quite a bit of us, so I think we can make a little more noise. How are we doing?
Yeah!
She's leading the pack. She's leading the pack. She just made a lot of noise for you guys. Thank you so much for being here. I don't know what day of the week it is. Is it Tuesday? Yeah, it's Tuesday. Today we have a very special guest who I'm guessing a lot of you know based on the shirts that I'm seeing. Serj Tankian is best known as the lead singer of Grammy award-winning rock band System of a Down. You need to come to all my events. I love it. But he is also a solo artist, composer, activist, painter, poet, and filmmaker. But tonight, we add author to the list as we welcome him to discuss his new, exhilarating, thoughtful, and beautifully written memoir, Down with the System. Without further ado, please give it up for Serj Tankian.
You guys are rambunctious. How are you?
Hey.
Nice. Wow, this is more like a rock show than a reading. All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for taking the time to come out tonight. This is absolutely incredible. So thank you. This means a lot. Thank you, sir. My pleasure. So what I'm going to do here is a little song and dance. No. I'm going to do a little reading from the introduction of my book. I'm going to talk to you a little about my intentions and why I wrote the book, and then we'll take a few questions. How does that sound? Thank you. Introduction. It was only 5 a.m. and I already felt like I'd been run over by a truck. Sitting on the edge of my hotel bed in Denver with the phone pressed to my ear, I was wondering how it had come to all this. On the other end of the line was Howard Stern. Well, not just Howard, but his whole motley radio show crew, and they were grilling me. 2 weeks earlier, System of a Down had released our second album, Toxicity, and it was now the #1 album in the country. I think it's safe to say we were as unlikely a chart topper as had ever existed in modern music history. A band of Armenian Americans playing a practically unclassifiable clash of wildly aggressive metal riffs, unconventional tempo-twisting rhythms, and Armenian folk melodies, with me alternately growling, screaming, and crooning lyrics that could pivot from avant-garde silliness to raging socio-political rants in the space of a single line. I'd be the first to admit it, it's not easy listening, but the news of our surprise chart triumph was drowned out a little by another unexpected event. The day we hit #1 was September 11, 2001. I was staring at my TV that clear, sunny, horrible Tuesday morning as I watched the second airplane hit the World Trade Center. Like most other people, I was in absolute shock. How did this happen? Who would do such a thing, and why? Politicians and many in the media quickly offered pat explanations like, they hate our freedoms. But I understood the history of the Middle East. I read the New York Times, I read The Economist, and that kind of oversimplification didn't sit quite right with me. Ultimately, I hunkered down and did what I always do when I'm trying to get my head around something I can't quite figure out. I wrote. 2 days after the attacks, I posted my thoughts in the form of an essay titled Understanding Oil on the band's website. Terror is not a spontaneous human action without credence, I wrote. People just don't hijack planes and commit harakiri without any weight of thought to the action. In the subsequent paragraphs, I dove deep into US foreign policy, particularly the steep price of our oil consumption. I explained that the 9/11 attacks were a reaction to existing injustices around the world, generally unseen to most Americans. there was a long, sordid history to consider. The US government had secured oil concessions from Turkey through secret deals after World War I in return for ignoring the Armenian genocide, which was perpetrated by the Turks. It had also overthrown a democratically elected leader in Iran and replaced him with a king in order to get access to that country's resources. The American government even allied with both Saddam Hussein and the Taliban when it suited their perceived interests. The sanctions in Iraq were contributing to mass suffering there because they usually hurt the poor disproportionately. The closer you look, the less shocking the 9/11 attacks actually were. I could already sense the gathering thirst for vengeance throughout the country and was worried about the consequences of acting on it. Quote, "If we carry out bombings in Afghanistan or elsewhere to appease public demand and very likely kill innocent civilians along the way," I wrote, "we'll be creating many more martyrs going to their deaths in retaliation against the retaliation." Instead, I suggested a multilateral approach, one that would bring the terrorists responsible to international justice. Most everything in that essay would be echoed by many others in the months and years to come. A lot of it has become conventional wisdom now. But at that time that it was posted, 2 days after 9/11, it did not go over well at all. The way a lot of people viewed it was like this: the whole nation is in shock and mourning, and the lead singer of one of the most popular bands in the country is suggesting that we might have brought this upon ourselves, that it's our fault. That's an overly reductive way to interpret what I was saying, obviously, but I get it. This was the pre-social media era, so the backlash didn't come as the all-consuming digital tidal wave you might expect today, but it came all the same. I was condemned in newspapers, on music websites, and all over the radio, including by Howard Stern, who was arguably the country's most popular and influential media personality in those days. Our record label insisted that we take the essay down off our website, and for the first and only time in my life, I acquiesced to such a request. The pressure was that intense. Notably, a lot of the anger at me and at the band had a xenophobic tinge. We were pillarized as immigrants from the Middle East who had the nerve to criticize the country that had taken us in and given us opportunities. Although Armenia is not actually in the Middle East. No one was getting hung up splitting geographical hairs, of course. The night before I got on the phone for Howard's show, I'd had a meeting with my bandmates at that same hotel. They weren't much happier with me than everyone else was. They'd all dreamed of what we'd just achieved, the #1 album. And that success was being drowned out by death threats and accusations that we were all traitors. This was the band's big moment, and my essay was threatening to ruin it for all of us. At that meeting, the first thing our guitarist Darren said to me was, "Are you trying to get us all killed?" I remember telling him that what I wrote was the truth, that it was all verifiable. Who cares that it's the truth? Now it was John, our drummer, going at me. He later compared it to giving a eulogy at a funeral and calling the dead guy an asshole in front of his grieving family and friends. It may be the truth, but it's not a very smart or sensitive thing to do. "It's not a good time to talk about this," he said. I was very apologetic to the guys. I had naively thought that in a democracy, you could always tell the truth. Going on Stern's radio show the morning that our tour was kicking off was seen as necessary damage control. I knew my job was to go on the air and calm everyone down. Rick Rubin, who produced both of our first 2 albums and was also the head of our record label, knew Stern and had helped set up the call. He also gave me some key advice. Don't try to challenge Howard. It won't go over well if you do. Just try to pivot him into talking about government abuses and things like that. He understands that the US government has done some bad shit in the past. So that's how I found myself sweating it out on the phone before the sun even came up in Denver. The odd thing about all the criticism I'd been getting was that because the essay had been taken down off the website, very few people had actually read it. This included Howard, Robin, and everyone else in Howard's studio that morning. All they'd read was someone else's skewed report summarizing what I'd written. I could tell from the minute I got on the phone that Howard and his crew were ginned up for a rip-roaring argument. I didn't take the bait. I declined to summarize my 3-page essay into a tight soundbite for them. Every time they lobbed an accusation at me, I'd calmly pivot, just like Rick suggested. Rather than elaborate on the US government's mistakes, I explained that all governments commit injustices. When I was asked about the dire human consequences of the no-fly zone and the embargo against Iraq, I merely pointed to the New York Times reporting on the subject. I admitted that posting my essay when I did, if nothing else, was certainly a case of bad timing. No matter what I did or didn't say, it seemed like Howard was fired up with righteous indignation, and his whole cohort acted like it was their patriotic duty to put me in my place. I can vividly recall staring out the window of my hotel room during the phone call and seeing the Denver Coliseum across the street. We were set to perform there that same night. Massive American flags were displayed on screens outside the arena with God Bless America playing on a loop from the speakers. That kind of stuff was everywhere in those days. Politicians, newscasters, journalists, hell, even the front desk staff at our hotel were wearing flag pins on their lapels. It was as if the flag itself had become some sort of universal marker to delineate what had become an all-consuming question in those weeks after 9/11. Are you with us or against us? Later that same day, George W. Bush framed it that way in an address to Congress. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. And that's kind of what that call with Howard was. It was his way of sussing out whether I, and by extension our whole band, was with the US or against it. There was no middle ground, no room for nuance. At one point, Howard asked flat out whether we hated America. No, we love America, I responded. It was true, I did and do love America. But I don't think I'd ever felt less a part of it than I did in that moment. All 4 of my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide. My parents met in Beirut, where I was born. We lived there until I was 7, when we fled the civil war in Lebanon and emigrated to California. I couldn't speak English well, didn't understand the culture, and grew up in a community near Los Angeles that was heavily populated with Armenian Americans. But I don't think I'd ever felt more like an immigrant, an outsider, than I did that day on the phone with Howard Stern. That said, I guess the interview helped put the pin back in the grenade, so to speak. I'm sure some crisis PR firm could point to it as a masterclass in deflection. But I didn't feel great about it. To this day, it still bothers me. I'm not angry at Howard or anyone else. I'm disappointed with myself. I have no regrets about writing the essay, but I have lots of regrets about not defending it more vigorously. I pulled my punches. It was a difficult moment to stand up for the truth. And though I'd initially done so by writing the essay, when the heat got turned up, I wilted a little. Look, it was an intense moment. People were really freaked out. When you turn on the TV, there was a rolling ticker along the bottom of the screen tracking the death toll from the attacks and offering up context-free quotes from experts and public officials predicting where the next targets might be. Water treatment plants, nuclear facilities, public gatherings. Our tour, which was called, I shit you not, the Pledge of Allegiance Tour, a title that, it should be noted, had been chosen months earlier, had to be delayed because travel was completely shut down across the country. We were one of the first bands back out on the road, and just the idea of getting thousands of people together in an arena seemed wildly risky. In the case of our tour, the danger was further ramped up based on the domestic threats and the hate being directed at us. Our first single, Chop Suey, had essentially been banned from the radio. The song's chorus, I don't think you trust in my self-righteous suicide, I cry when angels deserve to die, did feel like a surreal reference to the disturbing events of 9/11, though obviously it was written long before that. But the ban itself was just a misguided, knee-jerk effort by the country's largest radio conglomerate, Clear Channel, to prohibit songs they felt might upset listeners already distraught by the attacks. I suppose Chop Suey was an obvious candidate for this list of banned songs, certainly more obvious than some of the others, which included John Lennon's Imagine, Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, and Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. Amid all this tension and paranoia, maybe it's understandable that I backed down. I can look back on it now and see that if I had really tried to speak my mind at that time, to challenge the jingoistic fervor that had taken a hold of the country, it almost certainly would have fallen on deaf ears. No one wanted to hear that shit, and they definitely didn't want to hear it on the Howard Stern show. As Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky put it in their book, Manufacturing Consent, if you try to question the premise of the system in a 30-second soundbite, you'll come off looking like a madman. I was there to defuse a bomb, to quiet the death threats, to make sure more radio stations didn't drop us from their playlists, to keep our tour on track, to convince my bandmates I was still part of the team. There had always been a feeling within System that I cared more about our message than our political activism, than I cared about the band itself. Ultimately, this was probably more true than I realized or was willing to admit at the time. My bandmates had all grown up with dreams of being rock stars. I hadn't. I loved music, but my artistic journey was still very much in its infancy. In fact, I'd never studied or even really played music growing up, and it wasn't until college when this passion really took off. I had a whole life, interesting, multi-layered, diverse, before music became my everything. I was an activist long before I was an artist, and I've never wanted to be one of those vacant souls who speaks to millions but talks to no one. In that moment, though, the most important thing seemed to not be fucking everything up for my friends, or worse. People sometimes ask me how excited I was when Toxicity came out and hit #1, but all I remember is being unbelievably stressed out. The fact is, I had just turned 34 and didn't really have the emotional and spiritual tools to deal with that kind of anxiety back then. I'd recently started meditating, but in the early days of my spiritual practice, I mistook passivity for non-aggression. When Howard was coming for me, I knew how to diffuse his hostility, but not how to answer it. I hadn't learned the virtues of compassionate confrontation. This wasn't something I could simply read about or take a class on. It would take years, much experience, and a near collapse of System of a Down for me to fully understand it. Even today, it's an ongoing process. Just before I got off the phone with Howard, he wrapped up the segment by saying, "Serj came in here and he said the right things." If anything drives home the shortcomings of my appearance on his show, it's that sentence. I've never wanted to be the guy who says all the right things to make everyone feel better. That's not to say I'm trying to upset people, but rather, my life's work has always been about learning how to deliver hard truths at difficult moments in ways people will hear them. That was kind of the whole point of System of a Down, or at least it was for me. There is no doubt that morning on Howard Stern's show was an opportunity lost. I had a lot to say about American foreign policy, about our country's history of intervention in the Middle East, about how our freedom of speech itself is always the first casualty of war. But I didn't. I let my actions be dictated by fear. Fear of ridicule, fear of ostracism, fear of violence. Fear, frankly, that my bandmates would never forgive me. But I like to think that the lesson I took from that failure was more important than the failure itself. It's all those moments when no one wants to hear the truth that it's so important to tell it. Now I knew what it felt like to hold my tongue when it most needed to be unleashed. And I vowed that I would never let it happen again. there were some questions that were sent in that I'm going to just kind of talk through, and then I'll open it up for a few more questions from you guys. Why did you decide to write the book now? Honestly, someone asked. I got a call from an agent who's now a friend in London, and we had a chat. At the time, I wasn't very interested in writing a memoir. I wanted to write a philosophical book about the intersection of justice and spirituality. And we kind of talked about it, and he kind of posed the question, why can't you do both? Why can't it be a memoir but also deal with those philosophical ramblings? And so it started me on this journey of this book, which is why it's called a memoir of sorts. You know, it's not a typical rock memoir, if you will. What was it like coming to the U.S. as a kid? When we migrated, it was when the Lebanese Civil War had just started in 1975. I remember myself and my brother, Sivak, in our bedroom crouched because there were bombs falling. Now, when bombs are falling in a city, you don't know where they're going. You have no idea. That fear, that kind of inability to predict what's going to happen, you know, is incredibly, incredibly traumatizing for children. It's kind of stayed with me. And I always say, if you've ever heard a bomb fall, you will never allow your government to do the same to anybody, because it is so random. I mean, even guided missiles obviously have a lot of collateral damage, etc. So when we came to the US, leaving that monochromatic, violent life, coming into Hollywood, California in the 1970s with all the color and glamour and hookers and pimps and fucking craziness, was amazing, you know? The color of the sunsets were matched by the color of the cheese, like Kraft cheese. I was like, what the fuck kind of cheese is this? I've never seen orange cheese. So it was, but what stayed with me a lot was my uncle's record collection. He had a badass record collection. He had like Marvin Gaye and like you know, Michael Jackson, Jackson 5, and Chuck Mangione, and like Earth, Wind and Fire, like just amazing soul music, you know? And that was riveting for me. And then TV at all hours of the day, like fuck, as a kid, 7-year-old, come on. Can you discuss the moment you had, oh yeah, the epiphany I had when, so, unlike my band members, as I was reading earlier, I wasn't like 7 or 8 years old when I decided music was going to be my life. I didn't know that this was my calling until I was in my early 20s. I started playing music when I was 19. I was going to Cal State Northridge.
Matadors!
Studying business, marketing of all things. I just figured, hey, my dad is in business and I'll do something useful, you know, because I didn't know what I wanted to do, like most kids who are 17, 18 going into college, right? So I got a little Casio keyboard. I don't even know how I got it. Someone must have given it to me. And I just used it as a way of meditating away from my worries, away from my, you know, classes, away from the family trauma that was happening at the time in my life. And it got me started on the love for music, almost as a therapeutic tool, right? Like a healing tool. But at the time, I didn't think of music as a career. I went off, and you know, after college, I started working with my uncle in the jewelry industry and just doing many different things. But I wasn't happy. You know, the voice within kept on bugging me. Like, you got to be doing something else. This is not you. This is not you. At the time, my parents were going through this lengthy civil lawsuit that was very damaging. And I was doing a lot of translation, reading of, you know, transcripts, dealing with lawyers, and I thought, shit, I know civil law, I could just be a lawyer, you know? So I thought maybe I'd go to law school. I would have made a shitty lawyer. So I went and took these classes to learn how to take the LSAT. There's these classes you learn, you know, it was after a long day of working in downtown LA, driving to Long Beach to take these classes on a fucking rainy night, driving back home. While I was there, I saw all these really happy people that wanted to be lawyers, and I fucking got pissed off because I hated lawyers, and I couldn't stand the idea at the time. I have a lot of lawyer friends now, but I couldn't stand the idea of, you know, doing that. Like, and I thought to myself, why am I even fucking here? Sorry to cuss. On the way back home, I had a Jeep Wrangler I was driving. It was really dark. It was late night. I was tired. I was pissed off. It's raining, dramatic. So I literally stopped in the middle of the road and skid, and there was no one around, and I hit my steering wheel and I said, I don't want to be an effing lawyer. I want to do music. It was like this epiphany, but it was so dramatic and it was so out loud. It wasn't like sitting in your bedroom and going, I can't do this anymore. This is what I need to do. No, it was like really dramatic. Yeah, so anyway, that answers that question. I'm gonna skip a few of these here. They want to know about our 2015 show at System of a Down in Armenia. It was incredible. It was, you know, it's really interesting because, you know, all four of our grandparents on all sides are survivors of the genocide. So that was the 100th anniversary of the genocide. And we were part of the awareness, you know, campaign for recognition around the world, especially in the US here. And so we went there and we were about to play, and we kind of huddled as we do before we play. And it didn't feel like a show. It felt like some kind of mystical event where you're paying homage to your ancestors and giving credence to those around you and remembering why you're there and rocking. Like, it was like this weird combination of everything. And I describe it as the top of the mountain for System of a Down. I feel like there's few times in your life where something happens and you go, oh, everything I've ever done brought me to this point. It felt like that, you know? Yeah. Water. What was it like meeting the Dalai Lama? It was awesome. So the reason I wanted, you know, for years I've been contemplating the idea of writing about the intersection of justice and spirituality. So I had this unique opportunity where I got a call, a random call, from a friend of mine who worked at a composer's office, and he said his wife's making a documentary film with the Dalai Lama, and it's about music and spirituality. And he said, we're shooting in Philadelphia in 2 days, can you come? I was literally at the airport about to fly to New York for a musical I was doing, which turned out to be Prometheus Bound years later. But I was gonna fly to New York to do a workshop, and the flight was late, something was happening, and I mean, uncharacteristically, I picked up my bag and I said, I'm heading home. I don't feel good about this. I could Zoom this. At the time it wasn't Zoom, of course. But, you know, so I was literally driving back home when they asked me to go back to the East Coast, which I thought was pretty interesting. So I decided to go. It was the four of us. It was myself, Moby, Katie Tunstall, and Josh Stone. So 4 artists meeting the Dalai Lama. We each had the opportunity to ask 2 questions on camera. My first question, so we're there waiting for him, the Holiness, and they give us these little kind of scarves to give to him as a form of respect, which is beautiful. So we're standing there, we have our scarves in our hand, and His Holiness walks in, smiling like ear to ear. And I go around him and I give him my scarf. He starts laughing, grabs my beard, and starts playing with it like a 7-year-old, or like a 3-year-old actually. And I'm going, is this the Dalai Lama, my friend's kid? Like what is going on? Like, you guys, oh, I like this, I want mine to be like that. And I'm like, oh, fuck. You know? It was beautiful though. He had this incredible innocence in his eyes. I mean, he was an incredibly intelligent, he is an incredibly intelligent being, but yet he was free. He was free of what people think of him. He was free of all of the bullshit that we deal with in our lives on the external, you know? He could be that 3-year-old kid having a good time and then speaking geopolitics and spirituality and whatever in the highest degree, you know? Which I found to be incredibly rewarding. All right. Enough of me talking. I'd like to hear some questions, so let's start. I think Rachel's gonna help
This is really fun for me. He said I have all the power. Okay, I saw your hand go up first. Yeah.
First of all, Parev, I'm really happy to be here.
Parev, thank you.
I have a request. Do you mind?
That's
okay.
not a question.
So I'm a high school math teacher.
Okay.
Do you mind giving a shout out to Mrs. Malikian's math teachers?
Okay, you put me on the spot. So, hi, Mrs. Melikian's math teachers. Study your math.
Thank you.
Stay in
Hi,
school.
Jan.
Questions in the back, right here.
Oh, it's online. Yeah, Google it up. So it's back online. I don't know who put it up, but it was even used at a university as a class on geopolitical essay writing and stuff like that.
We have a hand back here with the blue hair. Yeah.
Hi, Serj.
Hi.
Hi. So, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My question is about your 2004 Souls concert. Can you talk a little bit about what
Which
it was,
concert?
the All Souls concert in
Oh.
2004?
Was that the one at the Greek Theater?
Yes.
Okay.
And it had a documentary at the
Yes.
beginning of it about the Armenian genocide.
Yes.
So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about maybe what you remember about organizing that.
Sure. So we've done the Souls concert. We've done 3 or 4 Souls concerts in Los Angeles as a way of getting attention and awareness for the Armenian genocide, and we've brought in a few nonprofit organizations to help disseminate information about genocide recognition. I remember, what do I remember about that? Damn, that was a long time ago, 20 years ago. Good question. You know, it's something that we all believed was very important to us, you know. It wasn't just a concert, again, it was something that was really important to us and our families. I also remember it because the day before was the day that I met my would-be wife, you know. So, yeah. One more question, or 2 more questions.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. That was amazing. Let's go right here in the front. Yeah.
Vale.
Do you remember your feelings when war started in Artsakh? Because I was in Armenia back then, and I remember my feelings. It was awful. So I want to hear your feelings when you first heard about it.
What's your name?
Arek.
Arek. So Arek's referring to 2020 when Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh, an enclave, an Armenian enclave of thousands of years where these people have been living there. I visited it twice. First time in 2001, I want to say, and once in 2017. And it was horrifying. It was during COVID. We were all like, you know, in our homes and unable to go anywhere. And you know, a dictator decided to start a war. They attacked, you know, 120,000 people and started this brutal campaign and lied about it at first, even said that they were attacked, which was nonsensical because they had press and media there at 5 a.m. ready to go on their side and all of that stuff. It was proven later that it was all a lie. But I've learned that dictators lie a lot. I mean, politicians lie generally, but dictators, you know, warmongers, just these days, it's like there's not even any accuracy in that kind of thing in terms of that belligerence. But the war started. There was a huge effort, humanitarian effort, to gather funds. We all participated in it. System of a Down came together and we wrote 2 songs that we put out, Genocidal Humanoids and Protect the Land. And it was the first time we had recorded together since 2005, 2004, I guess, Mesmerize, Hypnotize. And we put that out. We donated the funds to Armenia Fund, which is a large Armenian charity, with specific programs. We actually went and detailed 3 programs. One was prosthetic rehabilitation for veterans. One was a program that Azerbaijan had dropped those incendiary bombs, the, what are they called? The, like fire from the sky. Phosphorus weapons, thank you. And so there was a laser treatment to, you know, deal with that, healing for that, and, you know, similar kind of programs. And In 2021 and 22, Azerbaijan also invaded Armenian proper territory, recognized by United Nations and whatnot. So it's a vulnerable position Armenia is in. One of the things that I'm doing with all the press that I'm doing is making people aware that, as we can all see, genocide is still occurring today. Even if the US recognized the Armenian genocide, even if there were the Nuremberg trials with the Holocaust, until we change the kind of philosophy of profits over people, this shit's still continuing, and it's really sad. More than sad, it's something that needs to be changed immediately. Thank you for your
Thank you
question.
so much. You have done so much for our country.
Thank you.
All right, right there with the beanie. Yes, I saw your hand first.
I'm actually raising it for him.
There
Okay.
you go.
Hi, sir.
Hi.
Alexis Montalvo. Mike. Well, as an immigrant myself, from your introduction, like, really resonated with me. So, like, in the U.S., you said, like, people feel like, make you feel like you're not part of society. So you think, like, now in 2024, we're supposed to be more tolerable. You think there's less xenophobia, like, in
No.
this country?
I don't think there's less xenophobia or racism in the US than before. In fact, I think during the previous presidential period, we saw a lot of that come to the surface. And that requires a lot of introspection for the country as a whole. It requires better educational system. I always go back to, if I can go back to one thing that I can blame a lot of the stuff happening on, it is the cutting of education since the 1980s during Reagan's time until now, not just in the US, but in the UK, in different parts of the world, a lot of the Western world, I gotta say. Even in New Zealand, where I lived part of the year, they used to be the third highest educational system in the world, and they've slipped dramatically. And that's very sad, because an uneducated public is an easy public to manipulate. But it's there, but it doesn't mean that we have to give up hope, of course. We fight against it. We need the assertiveness and the collection of communities, and to remind those people with their racism that the original Americans are Native Americans and that they're not those people. So,
Thank you all. Do you one more question?
Sure.
One more question. I saw you raise your hand, sir. Yeah.
I want to ask you two quick questions.
Come on, buddy.
Your thoughts on Gaza, and also I wrote a song about the Armenian genocide, and when I wrote it, I had you in mind, I heard your voice singing it, so I was wondering if I could give you a copy of it.
I'll
if
listen
you
to
like
it.
it, if you sing it.
I'd be happy to listen.
Okay, give it to you now or after?
You'll give it to me and I'll give it to
Sounds
him.
good.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys are awesome. Thank you so
All
much for
right.
coming out today.
Thank you.
We've signed a bunch of books for you guys.
You guys look at your books.